I'm tentatively a convenience. There's a long story and a short story to that. I'll start with the long one. Sometime in the mid-1970s, my friend Hairbrain Stormdrain and I were going to start a band, and I thought, well, what function does a name serve? Meaning, in this case, the name of a band, and I thought, well, it's just tentatively a convenience. It's just a thing that's convenient to refer to in a tentative way, to refer with in a tentative way. But then Brian, Hairbrain Stormdrain, came up with the idea of naming the band Crab Feast, which I thought was a lot funnier, so I decided to just use the name tentatively a convenience for myself. I initially thought of it as an open context that anyone could potentially fit within, but I gradually narrowed it down to just refer to myself, although it's still potentially open. It answers the question, what's your name?
Okay. Can you go introduce yourself and then go straight into the short one?
I as tentatively a convenience. Tentatively a convenience as the answer to the question, what's your name? In other words, it answers by indicating what function a name serves.
Okay, one more time.
I'm tentatively a convenience. That's the answer to the question, what's your name?
Alright, cool. How long have you been going by tentatively a convenience?
I've been using the name tentatively a convenience for about 27 years now.
Did you get your name legally changed to tentatively a convenience?
I would hesitate to do anything legally. For example, take legal drugs, so I wouldn't change my name legally to tentatively a convenience. If I were to change my name legally to anything, I'd change it to pseudonym.
Pseudonym, alright.
My actual hands aren't showing at all, right?
No.
Okay. How's it look? Pretty good. This is the kind of thing that I, of course, think is truly funny that most people would just go, what?
I've used a variety of names for a variety of purposes. Tentatively a convenience is the primary set that contains these names, in some sense at least. So, for example, I've used the name Tim Orr. Tim Orr is a con artist and a sex object, or a sexorcist. The city of Baltimore was kind enough to name itself as a giant sex ad for Tim Orr. Tim Orr is also the public relations person for tentatively a convenience. I've also been E.G. Head, Egghead. Egghead is, of course, an intellectual and critic. I've been id Entity. Id Entity attempted to undermine reality maintenance traps. I've used various communal identity names, such as David A. Bannister, Monty Canson, Karen Elliott, Luther Blissett, and Alan Smithy, who made the recent Teenagers from Inner Space.
We will not have thousands of Gargans brought upon this land to destroy them!
I suppose that sooner or later I'll probably be Santa Claus and Bob Jones and Jesus Christ, or maybe Jesus Claus, or Bob Jesus Claus Jones, or whatever. I've also been Elvis Presley, for example, when asking the residents for a catalog in the late 70s, etc. And there's probably quite a few other names that I'm not thinking of at the moment.
Alright.
Spraticus, for example, or Radical, both of which are rebellious types.
Alright, well then should we...
And can you explain to me what you mean by kill normality before it kills you?
Well, that's pretty obvious. Normality is stultifying.
Hold on a second. I'm going to
right.
cut that off. So
Okay. Kill normality before it kills you is one of my favorite slogans. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but for those of you for whom it isn't, it just means that for me, normality is a stultifying thing that narrows the possibilities down, and the more the possibilities get narrowed down, the more your personality gets eradicated by it. Normality is like the psychological world's version of Nazism. So I prefer to kill normality at every possible moment, or at least when I have the energy to, so that I can continue to blossom like gin blossoms, perhaps.
So do you find yourself being different for the sake of being different?
No, I'm different for the sake of following my genetic code.
Okay.
I'm different for the sake of following my genetic code rather than for the sake of being different for difference's sake, although I'm not necessarily opposed to that.
Okay. And do you want to explain or talk a little bit about how you came about the slogan "Normality cuts off your sixth finger and your tail"?
Normality cuts off your sixth finger and your tail. Basically, if you're born with 6 fingers or with a tail, you might be considered to be a freak. And doctors, as you're a baby, might decide that it would be unhealthy for you to be a freak in a society that is obsessed with, which is pretty much most societies, with reducing people to the lowest common denominator. Therefore, they might remove your 6th finger and your tail, even though they can both be useful appendages. I highly recommend hanging on to every useful deviant appendage that you have.
Okay. And you mentioned something about the lowest common denominator. Do you find that discouraging when people try to overgeneralize you?
I'm absolutely opposed to oversimplifying, including in that last statement. I'm certainly opposed to people oversimplifying me, doing what I call projecting stereotypes onto me. So I try to provide conflicting information about what my so-called real personality is, so that I might cause some sort of cognitive dissonance in the projection of these stereotypes.
Okay. Let's see here. Talk about some of your experiences of people giving you, making fun of you or harassing you for your appearance.
People have been harassing me and threatening me for my appearance and for my behavior for the majority of my life, although there have been times when it's been much more intense. Since at the moment, by my own standards, I somewhat dress in drab, in contrast to my more blatant perversions of the past. I've been called Jesus Christ, Charlie Manson, faggot, Hare Krishna, skinhead, weirdo, and clown, at least. I'm definitely a weirdo. I'm really not Jesus Christ, although it's very nice of those Christians who vehemently assault me to accuse me of being that, although why they'd want to assault their God is beyond me, but it's not really beyond me, is it? I'm not really Charlie Manson either. I'm not quite that popular with the girls. And I'm not really into Hare Krishna either. Their just clothing styles just don't appeal to me, and I really don't like their music very much. And besides, I don't want to sell candles or incense.
Okay, so you had mentioned to me before that there was a period where you made fun every single day for a number of years, and you want to talk about that and how you kept from how you could tolerate it and not change.
People have made fun of me for most of my life for being a weirdo, an outcast, whatever. People have tried to turn me into a scapegoat, but unlike many scapegoats, I've actually had the strength to realize that if I persevered, I would probably outlive them in some way or another, at least through posterity. The more people were assholes toward me, which was certainly a very common phenomenon in most of my life, and will continue to be so, I'm sure, the more I realized that I didn't want to be an asshole like them, even though there are probably many people who think that I'm an even bigger asshole than them. But hey, I have an excuse. I've done it to survive. People have followed me down the streets, threatening me, strewn garbage around my place, set fire to my apartment. I was living in South Baltimore from roughly 1982 to 1985. At one point, I believe that my landlord's assistant paid a guy to move into the ground floor of the building. I lived in the second and third floors. The ground floor had been abandoned because it was a storefront. I believe that the landlord's assistant paid this person to accidentally start a fire there. So this is what I came home to one night. The place is as trashed as it is, not so much because of the fire, which fortunately didn't destroy very much, but because of the firemen coming in, not being able to see, trampling all over the place, so the ceiling is largely on the floor there. Everything is covered with smoke damage. Literally threatened to kill me, etc., etc. And I have persevered, and I think that in the long run, I probably have a better sense of humor for it.
So you can look back on it and laugh about it now?
I can always look back on things and laugh about them because mean-spirited people can always be turned into good fodder for stories. Basically, I have survived and have at times been forced to the brink of extreme psychoses by the amount of harassment and threats that I've gotten. Forced to the extreme to such a degree that people have gotten to be so afraid of me that they tone down their attacks for a while, never daring to attack me in groups of less than 3, which is the typical coward's way. And cowards are usually the people who harass and threaten other people because they're afraid of being harassed and threatened themselves, so they have to conform to what seems like the safest position, which is by joining the army, whether it's the sports army or the hipster army or whatever other armies of morons one could think of, and there are many of them, often embodied in the same ways of acting, but with slightly different uniforms. Kind of like the difference between the Steelers and the Ravens, for example. They wear slightly different uniforms, but they basically both represent the same mentality. Here I am wearing what I call salad dressing. I used to collaborate with a photographer known as Paula Gillen, who also went by the name of Polio Vaseline. This is one of the pictures that she took. Those things that are hanging around my neck were individual pieces of fabric cut into what I called frame of reference shapes. There were 6 different frame of reference shapes that had buttons in the middle of them, and then there were 2 different frame of reference shapes that had button holes in them. So every time I would wear this garment, I'd have to assemble all of these little pieces of fabric with the buttonhole pieces to make a new garment every time.
All right, so why did you dress so flamboyantly back in those days?
Given that I think that normality is like a room with mobile walls that are continually closing in on the people that it tries to reduce to the lowest common denominator, I felt like it's somewhat my purpose in life to wear clothes that are so bright or so deviant, etc., that they repel the walls by the sheer force of their bombastic personality. So I've spent a lot of time just trying to manifest my imagination, doing things like wearing big plastic devices designed to prevent people from stealing cassettes on my head as a hat, or wearing spring shoes so that I could bounce around a little bit, or wearing giant photos of light bulbs as a symbol of the idea, the comic symbol of the idea, or wearing, whatever, a postman's sweater while selling drugs, or wearing a Medusa hat in order to remind people that there's always the possibility that they might be turned to stone if they're looking at me the wrong way.
All right, and let's see. How would you describe your work ethic? Would it be fanatical or workaholic, or?
Well, I'm a psychological playfair-aholic. I haven't joined the self-help group for that yet because it doesn't exist, but I'm sure that I'll found it one of these days, probably after I'm dead, since I won't have time for it up until then. That might translate into workaholic. Basically, I feel like there's a lot to do before this manifestation of whatever it is that I am starts to rot to the point where it doesn't run as efficiently as it does at the moment. So I've got to hurry and get a lot of things done in the meantime. I often say that I don't really want to look back on my life when I'm about 75 years old and laying in the gutter somewhere, about to kick off. I don't want to say, oh shit, all I ever did with my life was watch TV and work my 9-to-5 job making condoms for other people who had all the fun. So I try to keep busy at all times. And if I didn't, I'd probably become so severely depressed that I'd take up jackhammer practice on my abdomen or something, and that would probably not be as much fun as what I'm doing at the moment.
Okay, so with all your various projects, your music and film, which ones do you enjoy doing the most, I guess?
I love doing everything that I do, all the writing, all the music making, all the movie making, all the imp activism, all the pun liberation front activity, etc. I have to keep bouncing back and forth between all of them so that I can exercise different parts of my brain and hopefully find some other parts of the brain that I haven't been previously familiar with to exercise. Not to mention the rest of my body. My penis and hands being two particularly favorite things to exercise, but I pretty much use all of my body. Maybe I don't use my phantom tonsils enough anymore.
When you say your penis and hands, is that at the same time, or is that?
No, it can be at the same time. I prefer to use them both at the same time, but not necessarily in connection with each other, more in the connection with a willing companion. Even more than one willing companion. Thousands at the Heinz Stadium, for example. Millions.
Have you ever thought about what your life would be like if you wouldn't pursue all your other ventures and you would just concentrate on mating?
If I just concentrated on mating, I'd probably have about 2,000 children, but I think certain parts of my anatomy would have probably become so engorged that they would have driven out the other useful parts, and I don't think I'd really be a very interesting person, but fantasies along those lines have crossed my mind in moments of extreme tumescence, phantom limb tumescence.
So here's a question for you. How do you get women to sleep with you on camera?
Well, getting somebody to sleep with me on camera is pretty easy. You just aim the camera at the bed and you both fall asleep or whatever, or one of them falls asleep, or, it's not, but getting people to have sex with me on camera is just a matter of both of us wanting to do it. It's not really a matter of me getting somebody else to do it. It's a matter of somebody else being as interested in watching the instant replays as much as I am.
Okay, so why don't you like to be called an artist?
I don't like to be called an artist because art is an outdated context, in my opinion, for creative activity. It's like calling someone who uses a pogo stick a pedestrian, especially a trans-dimensional pogo stick. I'm no longer preferring to be called something that's not relevant to what my activities are. It's much more relevant to think of myself as a mad scientist, decomposer, sound thinker, thought collector, has-been, psychopath finder, jack-off of all trades, etc. I just prefer to use what I consider to be appropriate and accurate language, and art and artist have no role in that exactness.
Do you ever find it that it's just easier to tell people that, you know, what you do is kind of like performance art?
Sometimes I'm lazy or in a hurry or whatever, and I might refer to things like performance art or music or other such banal topics. But I always end up psychically kicking myself in the ass afterwards for doing so.
So you prefer to go through your self-description again and maybe elaborate on some of the
Didn't I already do that before? I think I did. I call myself a mad scientist, decomposer.
I don't remember if we did or not. Well,
I'll just jump around through it then.
Okay.
Sometimes I call myself an airdresser. Of course, that's a pun off of hairdresser, but it refers to the airdrops that Dave Bacher and I did. And here's a personal that we put in one of the alternative weeklies, or weekly alternatives, in Pittsburgh to announce that we were going to fly over the city and to drop paper airplanes, which we did, over top of the CMU campus. Of course, we don't specifically say that that's what it's about, but we were hoping that people would read this and then happen to be on the campus at the time that this happened and make the connection, which I seriously doubt anybody did, but I'll read it to you anyway. UFOs on CMU, and that UFO apostrophe S is their mistake, not mine. It's not meant to be possessive, but you wouldn't expect anybody who works at a newspaper to know how to use English, so don't worry about that. You, contactee, me, alien. I'll be landing again on the CMU campus Friday, September 4th, around noon. Will you be there or what? Our mating will decide the fate of the human race. Remember, home skiing is like yard sailing. This would have been the missed connections section of the personals. And that's the paper airplane that we dropped 950 of over the CMU campus and surrounding environs. Free admission to Rave in Space. Must provide own transportation. We dressed the air by dropping paper airplanes out of a slightly larger airplane that wasn't just wind-powered. Sometimes I call myself a homonymphonemiac, which is a person who has an obsession with producing puns. Sometimes I call myself a psychopath finder, which is a person who is attempting to apply psychopathic energy to a new path other than the one that's usually laid out for psychopathic energy, which is usually extremely violent and not necessarily what I'm interested in. Sometimes I call myself a jack-off of all trades, which is a person who tries to get pleasure out of trying out a lot of different activities. Or I call myself a mad scientist, meaning a person who tries to experiment in ways that create situations that are, to a certain extent, out of their control and very glorious as a result of that. Or I'm an has-been, which is of course a takeoff on has been, but is also a reference to the use of the word as instead of the verb to be. In other words, it postulates a person who is playing a role as something rather than a person who's fixed into that role. Or I call myself a decomposer. D space composer, which of course means that I'm following in the footsteps of the great composers of the past who are now dead and rotting. It also means that I'm analyzing things. It's also a reference to my graduating from high school with a D average, meaning the lowest possible passing grade average. And I call myself a thought collector. Of course, that's a spin around of saying that I'm trying to collect my thoughts, but it means that I'm just trying to collect thoughts in general. I call myself a sound thinker. I think I explained that in that slideshow that I showed you, so maybe it's better. That's where I would have gone through some of these before in that slideshow. Sound thinker. And here's an example of sound thinking. You see the number 2 and the letter B and the word or, referring to a wooden paddle, well, not necessarily wooden, but a paddle that's used to propel a boat, and not, meaning, well, I forget the correct mathematician's definition of a knot, but you know what it is. And then the number and the letter again. But if you are not a deaf person, you would mentally be reading that phonetically, which would produce to be or not to be, the quote from Hamlet, the play by Shakespeare. The thing that I like about this language use is that it's what I call sound thinking, meaning that you would not understand it as the quote from Shakespeare unless you were responding to all of those language units as homonyms, as phonetic equivalents to, for example, the word to for the number 2, etc. So you're mentally thinking sounds in order to translate this into the quote. So you are having sound thinking, but it's silent sound thinking. There's not actually any sound happening physically while you're doing this. Let's see, what are some of the other ones? I call myself a sexorcist, which is, of course, total self-glorification. I'm a proponent of criminal sanity. People are accustomed to hearing the phrase criminally insane. I prefer criminally sane. We live in a class-based society in which the people at the top try to keep the people at the bottom in line and to keep them from usurping their position by making laws that they don't personally have to follow. The George Bushes and the Enron CEOs, etc. of the world, and the Bill Clintons too, for that matter, etc., or the Saddam Husseins. The list goes on and on. You're familiar with many of them, of course. The purpose of making laws is just to prevent the people who are subject to them from getting into the position of making their own laws, etc. Therefore, if you want to pursue self-preservation and you're at the bottom, you basically are forced into becoming a criminal or a toady. I have no intention of becoming a toady. So some people become criminally insane when they're subjected to this kind of pressure and take out their bitterness and hatred and frustration, etc. on what I might call the wrong people. In other words, the people around them rather than the people who are subjugating them. Other people become criminally sane and direct their bitterness and resentment toward the people who are actually keeping them under their jackboot. I prefer the latter approach. I'm also a low classicist, or a low classical musician, which is explained in depth in an essay of mine. But to give the abbreviated version, I'm a low-class person who is producing classical music or music or music. practicing promotextual, which is, of course, yet another Homonymphonemiacs, or Pun Liberation Front's pun, which is a takeoff on practicing homosexual. Most of my gay friends usually find that terminology to be pretty funny because it, of course, evokes practicing to be a homosexual rather than actually being one. In my case, I'm a practicing promotextual. I'm a person who's constantly practicing using text to promote my ideas, just like I'm doing now, using words to promote my ideas. I'm an HDJ, which is a hard drive jockey, or hard disk jockey, somebody who uses computers to whirl sounds around through the air. I'm a pin-up, a participant, a postal interaction network underground participant. I'm a headitor and archivist, somebody who archives things for the ear and for the head. I'm a professional resistor of character defamation. I've had many, many, many opportunities to practice this profession. People are often defaming my character, especially people who are envious of me, or even some people who have perhaps good grounds to dislike me. I'm a proponent of classification-resistant what-have-yous, which refers back to just resisting the enclosing walls of normality. I'm a toggle nutcase, which is a text reference because toggle case means the reversal of the usual lowercase and uppercase orientation. Nutcase, of course, is pretty self-explanatory. I'm the Princess of Dorkness's right-hand man, the Princess of Dorkness being my long-term collaborator and great friend, etc. And I'm a human attention ex spandex speculum, which means that I tend to go on and on and on and on and on, testing the patience of people who have very limited attention spans, which seems to be more and more people. It's truly astonishing to me how little people can pay attention to things in this new Modagogo TV society in which everything is reduced to a soundbite, and even then people can't pay attention to it. Moving screen, upon which shadow is projected from rear, is unchanging. Hence its motion becomes senseless, implying senselessness of materials used. Suggest removal of best friend's head for occupation of empty space. Have eating art supplies, chewing a pencil. In fact, your mind has probably already wandered off while I've been in the midst of this sentence, so let's just hope that it's wandered off to some place where this sentence will come back and haunt you. You might wonder about my mottos, such as anything is anything. I think that that's still probably the most profound thought that I've ever had, and I've tried to pursue an understanding of what that might mean to myself. If you think of anything as being a sort of blank, then of course that could translate into something like a doorknob is Kent's head, which is a good thing to think about. And then there's the political slogan, before you decide against biting the hand that feeds you, question why it has so much food in the first place. Now the typical saying is, don't bite the hand that feeds you. But the thing is that if you're a dog, for example, and you're being kept as a pet by a human, you're not necessarily there in accordance with your own will. You might prefer to be a wild beast outside running around, catching your own food, etc. But no, you're being held captive by this human, and they're controlling your food supply, and that's one of the ways that they keep you held captive. So maybe it would be better to bite the hand that feeds you and escape. But of course, there are many forces working against that in society, not only for dogs, but for humans as well. Most of us have our food supply controlled by people who are, to a certain extent, taking it away from us in the first place, and then giving back only small amounts of it to us in return. It's kind of like owing your soul to the company store.
You had mentioned a little bit about the class society, and you what class would you consider yourself in?
In this class society, I like to think of myself as a member of the no-no class, which I like to think of as a class that exists outside of the upper, middle, and low classes, although that could be completely delusory. So I did 2 classes. The first one I showed videotapes of guerrilla actions. The class was called the no-no class, and it was about doing guerrilla actions, and I told everybody in the class that no matter how hard they worked, they would only get a D, in other words, the lowest possible passing grade, because the class wasn't about grades, which upset some of the students who then dropped out immediately because they didn't want that to happen. Basically what we did was we took all of these broken umbrellas that I'd found and walked around outside carrying the umbrellas to create a variable height ceiling by clustering together and dominating the sidewalk on a day when it wasn't raining and it wasn't sunny enough to require a parasol. Otherwise, I might be associated with the so-called low class, especially since I'm not a so-called property owner, although if this world were less dominated by the idiotic ideas of the self-proclaimed aristocracy, we would have the commons back again, and there would be no such thing as property that was owned by anyone. It would all be communal, and I'm not referring to things like your stereo, so you needn't run screaming, because I'd hate to have my stereo taken away from me too. In fact, you'd have to pry my stereo from my cold, dead hand. But I probably would really relent before it reached that point. The property that I'm talking about is land. Land, and more land, and air, and things like that. I think that the self-appointed aristocracy would charge us for the air if they could figure out an appropriate way of doing it, and they're probably working in that direction as I speak.
Okay, and talk about how being in the low class or no-no class affects your work.
Well, being in the low class, putting aside the no-no class for the moment, affects what my so-called work is by actually putting me in the position of having to do it to survive, which is unlike the people in the upper class who may never have to work, who might have to just pick up the phone and make a phone call to force somebody else into working, or, work out some agreement with the WTO that lowers everybody's wages to below subsistence level so that they can fly around in their Enron jet and campaign for improving a lot of everybody while they do exactly the opposite. At any rate, it keeps me on my toes, because when somebody's shooting at you to make you dance, you have to avoid getting hit by the bullets.
I guess in terms of your creative endeavors at work, I guess is what you're not having enough resources or making do. How does that affect you, if at all?
By being generally without much money, I have to rely on other resources. And actually, there are an incredible amount of resources available, as any self-respecting Garbage Liberation Front member, practitioner could tell you. People who are reliant on money, especially money provided by other people in order to accomplish things, are pretty much the most pathetic people around. Fortunately, I'm not that bad off, so I can make do with whatever's at hand, and there's an incredible amount of things at hand, an infinite amount of things at hand. So that's partially where being a jack of all trades comes in. I think of something that I want to do, I look around me and figure out what's available to me to enable me to do it, and then I work with that. I've made 216 movies at this point. Almost all of them have been with borrowed and broken or sneakily accessed equipment. If I waited for the grant money that would pay for it, I'd still be waiting to make my first movie, for example.
Okay, and I guess in a nutshell, what is the goal the anarchist activities that you are involved with? What is the end result that you guys would like to see as a result to your energies and efforts?
As an anarchist, or as an individualist anarchist, if that's what I am, and sometimes I allow myself to be pigeonholed in that way, I don't really want to speak for other anarchists except to say that anarchy, of course, means without government, which basically means I'd rather think for myself than have somebody else tell me what to think. So most of my anarchist goals are along those lines. To think for myself and to subvert other people's attempts to force me to think in the same way that they do. Basically, I like to subvert the efforts of people who aspire to power by maintaining my own power without having it be something that subjects other people.
When you're dead, what do you want people to think about, tentatively at convenience?
When I'm dead, what do I want other people to think about me? I'm not sure I care that much. I just hope that when I'm dead, the ruling elite vultures don't immediately descend on everything that I've done and make a fortune out of it and turn it against its original purposes. As far as what people think about me, it's not really such a big deal. I hope that I'm not lied about any more than I already have been in my life. I would hope that my aura of resistance to character defamation would continue to spread out like a particularly volatile gas. Maybe slip gas.
So in your films and your other music, what emotion are you trying to invoke in people?
I'm not trying to evoke any particular emotion in people. I'm just trying to provide conceptual obstacle courses that are hopefully enjoyable enough to the people who are experiencing them to also be stimulating and inspirational. What emotions they experience are, of course, up to them. I don't want to manipulate them like emotional puppets, because then I'd be trying to go opposite to the idea of having them think for themselves. I'm trying to provide them with an experience, or trying to provide you with an experience that might be of some value to you and might lead to our becoming friends someday before I turn into slip gas.
So do you feel that you're successful with this most of the time, or?
As to whether I'm successful or not most of the time, it's pretty much impossible for me to say. Every once in a while, I have a new friend, or some guy comes along and wants to make a documentary about me, and then I feel like I'm being somewhat successful. But there are plenty of contrary experiences too. I do my best. I give it the old anti-college try. Or nuclear brain physics surgery school graduate try. You might ask, where is the rest of my body? But remember, talking heads have longer lives. So here I am at age 48, and hopefully, by watching this puppet theater, this frame of reference, in operation, in action, you'll be able to understand everything that motivates me, and every little ounce of meaning that's imbued in whatever puzzle pieces I may have scattered like wild oats. Alright, well, I managed to keep a sort of straight face throughout all of that. Yeah, was that enough, do you think?
Yeah. Got some good stuff there.
Yeah. I don't know, it's always strange. Because I don't really like to repeat myself that much, so I get tired of hearing myself say the same kind of thing, so I sort of try to make up things at the same time that I try to retain the important content, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Alright, well, I'm sure we'll see some of that pop in somewhere, somehow.
Yeah.